Welcome back to Game of Theories, where I introduce theories of management, administration, and leadership. This is episode 49. Today we'll explore intergroup leadership theory, a theory that explains how leaders can successfully bridge divisions between groups, departments, organizations, or communities by nurturing cooperation across group boundaries. Here's the problem that almost every administrator or leader has encountered in some form. You are leading an organization, a university, a school district, a hospital, a government agency, a corporation, and you quickly discover that the people inside it do not see themselves as members of one unified entity. They see themselves as members of smaller, distinct groups, nurses versus doctors, faculty or teachers versus administration, engineering versus marketing. Each of those groups has its own history, its own sense of purpose, its own informal norms, and very often its own suspicion of the other groups that share the building. You, as the leader, are responsible for all of them. You need them to cooperate, and you are acutely aware that whatever you say or do to build trust with one group may cost your credibility with another. That tension, the tension of leading multiple groups simultaneously, each of which is invested in its own identity, that tension is precisely what intergroup leadership theory was developed to address. The theory does not treat this problem as a failure of communication or a simple personnel issue. It treats it as a fundamental feature of organizational and social life that requires a theoretically grounded response. The intellectual roots of the theory run through social psychology, particularly the tradition associated with social identity theory, first systematically articulated by Henry Tajfel and John Turner in 1979. But the formal theoretical architecture of intergroup leadership as a distinct leadership theory is relatively recent. The foundational statement of the theory was made by Todd Pittinsky and Simon in their 2007 article in the Leadership Quarterly, and the theory was given its most rigorous organizational form in Michael Hogg, Dan von Knippenberg, and David Rast's paper in Academy of Management Review. Together, those works mark the field's recognition that leading within a group and leading across groups are different challenges, and that leadership research has spent far too long attending only to the former. Why does the intergroup leadership theory matter today? It matters because contemporary organizations and institutions are structurally fractured. Matrix organizations where employees report to multiple managers across functional and project lines, cross-functional teams which bring together specialists from different departments, post-merger integrations where previously separate organizational cultures must learn to work together. They all place leaders in precisely the position the intergroup leadership theory describes. In each case, leaders must bridge group boundaries, manage competing identities and interests, and create cooperation among groups that do not naturally see themselves as part of the same collective. And beyond organizations, the problem scales upward to communities, cities, and democratic societies, where political polarization and demographic diversity make intergroup leadership a civic necessity. What does intergroup leadership mean? This term can be misleading. It does not mean leadership that happens to take place in diverse organizations. It does not mean being fair to different employee groups. Intergroup leadership refers specifically to leadership that is directed at improving the relations and collaboration between different groups that may have competing identities, histories, or interests. The inter in the name is doing serious theoretical work. Pittinsky and Simon were among the first to name the phenomenon explicitly. They observed that strong leadership of one's own group tends to heighten rather than reduce the tension with other groups, what they call the in-group, out-group leadership trade-off. A leader who is an outstanding champion of their department, their faction, or their team may, in the very act of championing that group, signal to other groups that they are secondary. The reward structure of most organizations reinforces this. Leaders are typically held accountable for their own unit's performance, not for the quality of relations across units. Pittinsky and Simon proposed that a distinct form of leadership was needed. The leadership needs to attend explicitly to relations between groups, not just within the groups. Hogg, von Knippenberg, and Rast built on this proposal by grounding intergroup leadership in social identity theory, a theory I've already introduced in my previous Game of Theories video. The central theoretical contribution is the construct of intergroup relational identity. This construct names what effective intergroup leaders must create, a shared sense of oneness that links the group together without erasing their distinct identities. The interrelational identity is neither a simple merger of group into one undifferentiated mass, nor an acknowledgement that different groups coexist. It's something more precise, a superordinate sense of belonging that includes multiple groups while simultaneously validating the particular identity of each subgroup. To understand why this distinction matters, consider the two most obvious alternatives. The first alternative is what social psychologists call the common in-group identity approach. The leader promotes one unified group, essentially asking everyone to stop thinking of themselves as members of their subgroup and to think of themselves instead as members of the larger collective. The second alternative is no intervention at all, allowing subgroups to maintain their separate identities without any overarching superordinate identity. Hogg and his colleagues argue that the evidence substantially supports that both alternatives tend to fail. The first fails because it generates distinctiveness threat, which is the anxiety people experience when they perceive that their valued group identity is being erased. The second fails because it leaves intergroup tensions unaddressed. The intergroup relational identity addresses both failures by explicitly affirming that Group A and Group B each has something real and valuable to contribute, while simultaneously frame them as partners in a shared enterprise. The leader can satisfy followers' need for both belonging and distinctiveness. The psychological logic here draws on Marilyn Brewer's optimal distinctiveness theory, which holds that individuals seek to balance inclusion in the group with the maintenance of a distinct identity. Intergroup leadership, at its core, satisfies both needs at the same time. A leader who manages to stop two departments from undermining each other has not yet achieved intergroup leadership. The goal is to move those departments toward genuine appreciation and collaboration in each other's success. The absence of hostility is not the same as the presence of cooperation. Understanding the construct of a theory is not enough. The deeper question is, why does intergroup leadership work and when it works? I'll explain the mechanism through which a leader's behavior produces intergroup outcomes. The fundamental mechanism is identity recategorization, rooted in Tajfel and Turner's social identity theory and Turner's and colleagues' self-categorization theory. Both theories explain why group membership is so psychologically important. When people categorize others as members of an outgroup, they are activating a set of cognitive and affective processes that generate favoritism towards the in-group and frequently derogation of the out-group. Those processes have a biological basis. Perceiving an outgroup member can activate neural systems associated with vigilance and threat detection, particularly the amygdala, which plays a role in processing socially relevant and potentially threatening stimuli. At the same time, brain regions involved in empathic processing, including the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, often show weaker responses when individuals observe the pain or suffering of out-group members compared to in-group members. Those findings do not imply that empathy toward out-group is impossible, but they suggest that social categorization can shape automatic emotional responses making it easier to empathize with those perceived as one of us, the in-group members, than with those viewed as them, the out-group members. The intergroup leadership is therefore partly a process of reshaping social identities and group boundaries so that former out-group members are integrated into a broader sense of we. This is the biological processes that intergroup leaders must work with, deeply ingrained tendency toward us versus them that operate partly below the level of consciousness. The mechanism of recategorization addresses this by changing the boundaries of us. When a leader successfully establishes an intergroup relational identity, followers begin to perceive themselves of the former out-group as a part of a shared in-group. This cognitive shift has downstream affective and behavioral consequences. People extend norms of fairness, empathy, and cooperation to those they perceive as in-group members. A leader who can shift those perceptions, even partially, can increase trust, reduce intergroup bias, and unlock forms of cooperation that were previously constrained by social characterization and out-group distrust. But recategorization alone is insufficient. And here is where optimal distinctiveness theory becomes important. If recategorization is too aggressive, if it asks people to abandon their subgroup identity entirely, it produces distinctiveness threat. When people feel their group identity is going to be erased, they tend to defend it by becoming more, not less, identified with their subgroup. They become more conscious of the group boundary that separates us from them, not less. This is why enforced assimilation tends to backfire. The intergroup relational identity addresses this attention by explicitly validating subgroup distinctiveness within the superordinate identity. It signals to each group, you don't have to give up who you are to be part of what we're building together. This message can release the distinctiveness defense and allow followers to invest in the superordinate relationship without experiencing it as a sacrifice. A second major mechanism is what realistic conflict theory contributes to the analysis. Groups often conflict because they perceive their interests as incompatible as zero-sum. Intergroup leaders address this by changing the perceived reward structure. The introduction of superordinate goals or the explicit demonstration of mutual interdependence reframes the situation from competitive to cooperative. When two departments understand that a joint project's success will benefit both of the departments, and that neither can succeed without the other's contribution, the logic of intergroup competition erodes. Leaders engineer those perceptions deliberately through how they structure tasks, how they communicate organizational priorities, and how they allocate allocation and resources across groups. Role theory and boundary spanning add a third layer of explanation. The leader in an intergroup context occupies a structurally unusual position. They must be credible to multiple groups simultaneously, each of which may be watching for signs of favoritism toward the other. Let's use procedural justice as an example. When members of different groups perceive that a leader is distributing resources and opportunities fairly, and that their voices are heard in decision-making processes, they are substantially more willing to cooperate across group lines, even when the outcomes are not what they preferred. Fairness in process becomes a substitute for certainty of outcomes, which is especially important in intergroup settings where no outcomes is likely to be equally satisfying to all groups. One additional mechanism deserves attention: the role of social exchange in building trust across group lines. When a leader structures conditions in which members of different groups have repeated positive interactions, such as collaborative task force, cross-group arrangements, joint problem-solving forums, each successful exchange slightly erodes the prior distrust. The intergroup leader's job is to create precisely those conditions. The leader becomes the architect of intergroup communication. and the trust that develops from positive group exchanges gradually build the relational foundation that makes an intergroup identity feel real rather than rhetorical. No theory is perfect. Let's turn to its limitations and unresolved questions. The first limitation is about the role of power and status inequality between groups. Much of the empirical work on intergroup leadership has examined groups whose power relation is roughly symmetrical. But many of the most consequential intergroup conflicts come from groups with asymmetric power, a dominant majority and a marginalized minority, a resource-rich department and a perpetually underfunded one. In those contexts, the question of whether the lower status group will trust an intergroup relational identity is not the one that existing theory fully answers. A lower status group has reasonably grounds for skepticism. Previous appeals to unity have historically served to consolidate the dominant group's advantage while asking the subordinate group to abandon its social identity. This is a boundary condition on the intergroup leadership theory. The second limitation is the institutionalization problem. Much of the intergroup leadership literature centers on what a particular leader does during their tenure, but the organizations are long-lived and the leaders are not. What happens to the intergroup relational identity and to the cooperative relations it sustains when the leader leaves? Can the structure of identity integration outlive the architect? The theory has relatively little to say about this, and it is the question with direct implications for leadership development and organizational design. In this video, we've learned about intergroup leadership theory. Effective leaders are not those who erase differences in the name of team cohesion, nor those who celebrate differences in ways that leave groups permanently isolated from each other. The effective leaders are those who make it possible for groups to see each other as partners, as distinct, valued, and indispensable partners to a shared goal. And that is what intergroup leadership theory teaches us to do.